Hi and welcome everyone to Breakpoint Security Podcast Season 2. The topic for today is From Threat Actors with Love, Tackling Malware Attacks for Healthcare. The level of sophistication of malware has grown fast during and since pandemic. And this has allowed attackers to run malspam campaigns across different sectors in the industry, but particularly in the healthcare domain. At the heart of these attacks were healthcare and medical devices and the related infrastructure. Today, we discuss malspam and how teams can tackle this issue effectively in their organizations. To discuss this, we have an eminent personality today. We have Shyam Sundar Ramaswami. He is Senior Staff Cybersecurity Architect, CyberLabs GE Healthcare. He has worked on malware and memory forensic investigations and has published several of his original research in conferences like BlackHat US, Qubit, DeepSec, NullCon, and several others. Hi, I'm Neelu, a technical security enthusiast and your host. I welcome you to the Breakpoint Security Podcast. In this podcast, we'll explore the depths of defensive security. We learn the methods and techniques that the smart security teams are using to solve practical security challenges today and innovate their way into the future. Welcome to Breakpoint, Shyam.
Neelu, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm super excited for season 2. I was a little gutted I was not part of season 1, but opening the season 2 account with me I'm super happy to be a part of it. And first of all, you're doing a fabulous job. Cybersecurity podcasts are very, very interesting. I've been part of many, and I was looking forward to be part of this. Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, you're welcome once again. And we wanted to start season 2 with a bang. So here we are. All right. So with respect to malware attacks in healthcare, I think I wanted to get some of the obvious things out of the way. For the past few years, right, with the pandemic coming in, we have been seeing a lot of COVID-19 themed, malicious spam, as we call it malspam, and a lot of these campaigns delivering a good amount of malware for people and targets, for organizations, and be it, for some time I was hearing things like Hansitter. These are all Trojans. It could be like CAGBot, right? For some time I heard about that as well. And it could be not just Trojans, it could be different kind of malware. It could be embedded in things like, for example, macros, especially in MS Office documents, because there is a high level of trust. So we have been seeing that traditionally as well, but the number, quantity, and the targeted attacks have increased in the past few years. So earlier, of course, for the past few years, there were this old school malware, as I like to call it, where you would have static malware, which could be detected by a lot of antiviruses. You would have static signatures, which they can catch and they can detect. But recently, the threat landscape has changed a lot, right? It's changed significantly. We are seeing a lot of polymorphic malware, which keeps changing its packaging and structure on the fly. We also see fileless attacks happening, where the malware can be in memory or execute in memory completely and can be difficult to detect. And to the extent that, just for the audience to know, the stats that is going around is most of the malware today, as of today, and some even say to the extent of 90 to 95%, that we see today is unique to the file system, which means that it's difficult to catch it with static signatures. So the first thing that I wanted to know from you is, how can the current generation antiviruses defend against such sophisticated malware, particularly, and what can organizations do? Like, what can they leverage to be able to detect, first of all, this kind of sophisticated malware?
Traditionally, what happens with malwares, especially here, is they always try to beat the the history and the widespread nature of the variants. So the landscape keeps changing at several minutes and several point of time. Okay, so if you take example, I would classify malwares for this question pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Now, the pre-pandemic era of malwares have always been, Handsetter, the trick bot, form book, bazaar loader. There have been bunch of variants that have been targeting traditionally exploits, right? Now, everybody understands malware is technically a piece of code that's going to execute in a victim's computer. But what exactly is it doing? Is it exploiting a vulnerability per se, or is it doing something different? Is what the whole ball game is all about. But if you see, traditionally, Office documents have always been a huge prey of these malwares. And that's what we usually call it as malspam, right? Malware which comes in as a spam attachment. Now, there have been several researchers. If you probably Google up, you'll see tons and tons of college projects, research papers on classifying spam emails. But however, when it comes to malspam, it's a whole different ballgame altogether. So my Office documents, technically Microsoft Office documents, have always been the centerpiece of attraction. You see a yellow box in my hand right here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so probably if I probably open this box, and let's say a small toy comes out of my box and starts clapping hands, and then I push the box inside again, the toy goes back and stops clapping. So each time I open the box, the toy has to come. So you just have to imagine there's a toy here. That's basically macros, right? It's a programming aspect where you automate a bunch of things. Now, gone are those days where you were speaking about how malwares operate from the past. I cannot send a virus, which technically the world calls it, in an email, and then somebody opens the virus and then probably gets infected. That's because of the role of antivirus vendors in the market today. There are technically more than 90 antivirus vendors. And gone are those days if I attach if I attach a malware in an email, it's going to obviously get scanned and blocked, which you meant by, which is called a signature-based detection, right?
Yeah.
Now, times have changed. And you mentioned a point, which is pretty brilliant, saying that there are a lot of COVID-themed malwares that were operating. So threat actors, which we usually call them, always prey and operate and, leverage the most happening events that's happening over a period of time. One classic example is Avengers, Endgames, and Game of Thrones. Now, these were the two biggest feats that basically happened on the same month. And these were the two events that happened over a year, where both there was a big movie and there was a huge TV series finale that happened. There were a lot of malware attacks, themed, saying that there was a leaked episode out, you can watch it, and all of those things. Then a lot of people got infected. And there were instances where subtitle files also disguised itself as malwares and they were operating. No, attackers always find a way to do it. But particularly with malspam, right? The pandemic has opened a lot of doors, especially with companies and people bringing in devices that's supposed to be at work is probably started coming home now. Now your landscape widens. You don't have a proper Wi-Fi the Wi-Fi security at home, and then you start inviting all these downloads and malspam targets you. But there's been a phase in this pandemic, especially where our traditional macro-based malwares were not operating much, where your antivirus would easily catch it like a snap of a finger, like how probably Thanos snaps his fingers. So there was a new strain of malwares, which is an old technique, which were basically called as macroless malware. I open the box and I find there's no macro inside it, but I still get infected. How? So this is how the malware actors basically, or the threat actors, operate. They made use of Office documents, which is called as something called as web settings. Now, whenever you open a Word document, I don't know how many of you were probably. So I'll probably throw a question back at you. Have you ever unzipped a Word document?
Yeah.
So when
Rarely
you unzip
though.
a Word document,
yeah.
Rarely though, right? Now, the thought never comes to a lot of people, right? Nobody wants to unzip a Word document. You probably ask this question, people say, why in the world would I do that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But if you want to see the deep down internals of a Word document, you will have to unzip a Word document. It's basically an XML tree structured document. That's where all your multimedia, text, pictures, XML, everything is stored. Now, there's a settings folder, if you would observe. There's something called as keywords, which means the format of an XML is usually checked. But there's a small flaw in that. If you use a keyword called external, you can make your Word document talk to the outer world. So what threat actors started doing with this macroless malwares was the document never contained the malware. Opening the document actually downloaded the malware. Now, that was a huge strain because there is no macro. Your signatures will not work. Your Yara rules probably will not work in this case. And there are tons of concepts here which probably would fail and will never work. Now, this is basically, I was working on some of these things during the pandemic, where I saw a strain for a stretch of 3 months, where none of the antivirus vendors detected this. And all of them had the same malspam theme, which was probably, office, shipping related supply chain kind of attack, saying your shipping is probably stuck in the customs because of pandemic. You need to sign this form. There were COVID based themes also saying that you're eligible for UK's, honorarium of such and such amount of money because of COVID. The names and the faces and the trends changed according to geographical locations, but the content delivered was the same. Macroless malwares, which you are probably talking about. And the other section which we usually call as living of LAN binaries, where it lives in the memory and probably dies in the memory. One classic example, Nilo, would definitely is Meterpreter, right? Lives in the memory, Meterpreter payload dies in the memory, right? So exactly like that. So when you asked a very interesting question. Now, how do traditional AV vendors will act upon this? Now, the static and the signature-based analysis kind of fails here to a greater extent. Now, the cost of analyzing these malwares kind of moves drastically, plus a time value is added to it. At some of the time, these goes undetected. The only way you can probably do is memory forensics, or there are quite a bit of solutions which you can do. And there we'll probably touch upon those things later. What are the other tricks in the trade that you can use to do it? Now, this has been the history of malspam, and this has been how the malspam operates. One classic example, Neil, I would probably talk about is Emotet. It was active for it has been active technically for 14 years.
Oh, okay.
And the beauty of the whole thing is Emotet has always been delivering via Word documents. Now you would write signatures, you can write Yara rules. Yara rules basically a Swiss Army knife where you write patterns. But still, how these guys manage to do it. One another very interesting example which I've stumbled upon during my research days in the past is Microsoft's equation editor. So I never knew, honestly, there was a feature called as equation editor until when I opened a Word document, it was suspicious. There were no macros. But how I saw a huge formulae for one page. Okay. Now I was like surprised, like, why the hell somebody puts a formula inside it, right? Then what happened was I was clueless. Now, usually when we do malware analysis, we kind of do static and dynamic. I am pretty finicky and paranoid about a lot of things. So I kind of open a lot of things at one shot. I was looking at the process. I was looking at the memory. I found this equation editor being triggered when this document was open. This equation editor section was always been, that part was working. Why? Then I figured out that Microsoft had a vulnerability where an attacker can overflow the equation editor with a huge formulae, which results in a buffer overflow, which opens a back door. Now, see, the whole beauty of it is how AV vendors have to up their game and ante every time, over and over again, because of the techniques and the cost involved in doing it. Now, when you spoke about living in the memory, right? None of these techniques work. you'll have to do only memory forensics, which is a very expensive affair to do it. So this is how malwares have, it's a cat and mouse game. So sometimes we win, sometimes they win, and sometimes they go totally undetected, and sometimes they get caught off guard. And I've heard from one of the very famous the big wigs in the industry. I've rubbed shoulders with quite a bit of them in conferences in BlackHat. I've heard from them saying that threat actors usually write these malwares, and in their development stage, they basically upload it to Aristotle to see if they are detecting it or not. Now, that's a very smart piece of ploy, right? 85 antivirus, 88 vendors are there. You write a malware, upload it and see if they are detecting it, then you tweak it. See again if they're detecting it, you tweak it. And then finally, you have a product where none of this gets detected. So yeah, so that's how these AV industries kind of works, and they have a lot of techniques in their back, but sometimes some of the malwares beat them to the finish line. So that's my take on that question.
Yeah, actually, and it's been there for a while, I would say, I think, because I myself did a little bit of exploit development long back. So we would do the same thing sometimes, but I think that is a rabbit hole I don't want to go into. There are a lot of techniques, and even uploading to Aristotle can expose the signature of your malware. So we would do multiple round of encryption, and we find that okay, it's not detecting anymore, and then but it used to seem easy. I'm sure for those who have been doing it for years, they would have a lot of more advanced techniques and places where they see or sniff if it is being detected or not. So in short, for the antiviruses detecting these kind of malware today, there are, if I understand correctly, there are techniques that they use and they can do that, but not with the usual, static signature detection techniques that we have been seeing. Okay, but with respect to malware, and since we were just talking about developing exploits, something that I have been curious about is there's a lot of stuff that has come into the market with healthcare devices, right? Healthcare or medical devices. We had Windows and Linux earlier with respect to their, base OS. Now we also have Android, iOS-based platforms where these are there. But I think majority of the operating systems that these devices would generally be working on would be Windows or would be Linux based. Now, from my own experience of doing it, like I was telling you, and creating payloads, it would be very different. So if we are having a same exploit across Windows and Linux, the exploit itself will need to be crafted differently for Windows and differently for Linux. And even for different versions of Windows, right, you'll have to have different exploit because the memory structure is slightly different in different versions of Windows itself. But with Linux, it would be quite different. Now, while Windows memory, as I know for sure, is very well documented, the whole structure is known in many cases. There are a lot of tools available. There are also few available for Linux, but it's not as well documented or captured, is what I would say. What I was curious to know is, does that apply to the OS that healthcare devices are based on? Like the healthcare device forensics itself has this gap as well. Do you see that? And how do security teams, who will also need to know, right, the structure of malware, how it works, and the OS itself, how do the security teams navigate this gap where the documentation for Linux might be much lesser as compared to that for Windows?
That's a very good question. So probably we love decoding cyber attacks, Neil, okay, but the moment we see a cyber attack on a Linux server or like a custom OS, and it's absolutely a big nightmare for us. The reason being is some of these advanced attacks, right? If you see the trend in the healthcare industry, I probably just rewind a little bit to do your question again to add something. Post pandemic, the lot of the sectors that have been infected or been targeted are basically supply chain, healthcare, and also energy and power renewable resources. These three things were absolutely off radar, and not much news you'd have probably heard of in this pre-pandemic, right? And see, healthcare attacks, usually what people talk about is, I mean, is more of cinematic style, saying, oh, what happens if somebody hacks the pacemaker? What happens, something, the heart stops. There is IoT device in that. I mean, there was research work done at it, but coming to the practical aspect of things, right? Most of the healthcare devices will never connect to the internet. But however, there are a lot of R&D activities that usually happens inside the healthcare industry. And some of the healthcare industrial devices, let's say, if they even talk to the internet, let's take IoT for an example, IoT based devices. Now, we've come to a level where these scans and all can be IoT devices, remote based devices, and they heavily don't operate on Windows, they operate on Linux. Let's say some of these devices get attacked, it's a huge call to perform a forensic activity. Now, you neatly bifurcate it, right? I mean, when you ask this question, you neatly mention that Windows versus Linux. I mean, Windows has always been documented, and Windows has always has the ability that, the basic structure of looking into a process's memory. You can always leverage one process's memory with another process. You can use the APIs to play around freely with a lot of things. That's the reason why writing Windows malware is also very easy, because
Easy.
you like it's I usually refer Windows APIs as Master Chef, a pantry, because you just need to know the recipe and all the ingredients are there for you. You just need to go and take it and come. But Linux is a very different ballgame. Now, when you probably do Windows, right? Windows, it's either XP or Windows Server, and there are only 3-4 service packs that probably apply to a lot of things. It's Windows 8, 10, or 11. And it's pretty well documented, and a lot of plugins were obviously developed for Windows. The overall structure of a Windows analysis of memory forensics or malware is basically either look at DLLs, registries. It's stored somewhere. Okay. There is always something which we usually say stored somewhere or you can refer to. But Linux, it's totally different, especially in healthcare. It's you will never get a profile. So when you do memory forensics, right, we call something as a profile. Now, memory forensics, if you see from like a 50,000 foot view, if you probably go very closer to it, it's scary. Okay. But if you see from a very 50,000 feet view, I mean, I'm just going to break a lot of bubble here. Okay. Here. Memory forensics, it's just nothing but walking through the memory or just walking through the data structure of Linux. That's all. A memory map is nothing but a data structure which would probably be doubly linked list. You're just traversing the doubly linked list through a framework. Manually cannot do. That's why some good souls developed something like recall or volatility for you to do it.
Yeah.
Now the pain remains to a point in Linux is where see, you can easily, there are a lot of magic numbers which we usually call, right, in files. Now, let's say 5D4 says probably talks about exe. If you see the MZ header, you can see it's exe. Similarly, there are magic numbers which we usually call as KDBG. Okay. Using the KDBG values, you can see in the memory saying that, hey, this number, this serial number exactly matches a Windows XP, or it's an SP1, SP2, it's documented. But for Linux, it's totally different. The mapping, the kernel, the memory structure all looks different. You cannot do the profiling just like that. So there is a way that you have to create a profile. Now there comes the huge pain point here. Okay. Now in usually happens in Windows is you can just take the dump of the memory, save it as a raw format, or save it as a mem format, and then you play around with it. Now the 101 principles of digital forensics is never make the infected device connect to the internet, or don't do any transaction inside it. But here, when it comes to the Linux part of things, you'll have to go to the machine and take a dump of the memory, and you'll have to do an X set of things to get the profile version of it, build it.
Yeah.
Now, when you build when you build something on that Linux, it's probably against the chain of custody rules in forensics. You are making some sort of an alteration in the infected machine. Now you have to build the profile right. You have to make the profile properly, and then you bring it. If you take Windows forensics, for example, the plugins are quite a bit vast. But if you take your, a classic example, I'll tell you, right? We've worked on a lot of crypto miners. Okay. So what do you need to know for a crypto miner? You want to know what DLL files it called in the memory. You need to know what process it used. You need to know what network connections it made. And probably you need to go and take a process and look into the process's memory to see what strings dump it had. 5 to 6 things.
Yeah.
You can do it in 15 minutes work. This is in Windows. This is what we also expected when we started working on Linux. A couple of attacks we worked on it. Okay. Very, very high profile attacks. So that's when we found out the number of plugins that you work on Linux is very minimum. And you cannot just go into one process and see the memory and dump. You have a mem map. You will have to see the mapping of the memory, starting of the memory address. There are tons of things. And especially when you come to a custom operating system, which is being used in most of the healthcare industries and supply chain industries and wind and power industries, they don't use the the Linux version directly. They write a wrapper on top of it. They harden it. They do a tons of. How do you know what profile it is? How can you build a profile out of it? And then there are no plugins for you to do the investigation. Not much is there. That's when an effort of you.
Is it the same for you? Like, does it take the same effort if it's been configured in a certain way? Like, for example, just from an endpoint perspective, if SC Linux or other such configuration or protection is turned on, is it better, or is it the same when it comes to healthcare devices?
There is a yes and a no to this answer. Now, sometimes many of the protections will not be turned on due to performance issues. Sometimes
the classic. Yeah.
Exactly, right. So this sometimes the clock time hits the roof. So they'll have to turn off a couple of features. And see, this is where the whole thing changes, right? Now, what I'm usually saying is when a cyber attack happens from a Linux standpoint for supply chain, power, and healthcare, there is not much of an infrastructure to perform this forensic activity, especially analysis of malwares. Now, because the ground is different, the ball game is different, not enough plugins, you'll have to write an extra set of efforts. With the bare minimum of stuff that you have to build a report and gather the evidence. Now, that's a huge difference. I mean, people like us, we are making conscious effort, to contribute to the community of open source by working on some of the plugins. There'll be a lot of work that we're also doing from our end to see how you can, because healthcare, supply chain, and the power energy renewable is the next big thing in the next 5 years if you observe. So there will be a lot of there will be a lot of targeted attacks. A very simple example, I'll just probably collate your bringing together previous question, this question. We was talking about malspams in the previous question when you had asked me, right? Now, if you see Practo as an app, right, I can see every doctor's profile. I can see his email. I can call him and book an appointment. Now, how long it's going to take? Don't get any ideas here, but I'm just saying how long it probably is going to take for someone to craft an email saying that, hey, this is the report that was supposed to be viewed by you, and you send a malspam. Especially a PDF-based malware is absolutely massive in the context of today's industry, right? I mean, they have the provision of JavaScripts, and I have an interesting piece. Probably we'll talk about this DICOM's X-rays based malwares. Also, further down the line, we'll probably talk about it when the appropriate time comes. But just imagine, right? I mean, if I can send in a PDF file saying that, hey, this is my X-ray, I scanned it for you, and you insert a JavaScript inside it, when the victim opens, nothing happens. But in the background, it's going to download through PowerShell a malware and infect you.
So just in short, for this thing, right, what can teams use? Like, are there certain plugins that you recommend? Are there some platforms, forums where they can get the right tool set for this? Or
so especially what happens with volatility 2 and 3, right? I did a comparison study. The Linux plugins are always being pretty less. Maybe because of the complex layout of the memory or a lot of other aspects. Because they don't operate with DLLs, only you can see the network connections, only the processing for the mem map and a dump of things. So there has been a lot of research going on into it. I'm not too sure of what more plugins are coming into it. But if you want to have a good, reading about how malware and memory forensics especially works, can probably refer people like Andrea Fortuna. She's done a lot of memory forensics work, and yeah, tons of stuff is there in the internet about it. So, but what I would usually say is it's always the usual word computer world way works, right? There's always been a discrepancy between Windows and Linux, so that gets more weightage.
Yeah, that's true. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think we'll also provide that reference for the
sure.
listeners later in the web page for this. While you were on the topic of DICOM, right? Just some time back, you were referring to DICOMs, and I just remembered attending your talk in NullCon around DICOM process injections. Uh, in your session that I was looking at, it was very extensively talking about how to carry out, DICOM process injections, and I think that's well documented. I'll also share the link for that. It's the video is also public, so that the listeners can refer to it. And it was quite interesting, but it was totally about the attack on the offensive side. What I was curious to know for our listeners was how can teams detect these kind of attacks, and not just detect but also prevent these kind of attacks in a systematic way. What is the method? Is there a methodology to detect these kind of attacks? Is there a systematic approach that they can have that can help organizations prevent these kind of attacks, particularly DICOM sort of attacks? Maybe you can also briefly talk about what is DICOM, like digital imaging and communications, but a little bit more about how that's used.
Sure. So, like, I mean, that's a good question. So, a very interesting question. See, I'll probably give you the answer bluntly straight to it, saying that how can we detect DICOMs and stop it? Honestly speaking, there's not much an industry solution that's available in the market, right? So
So that's why you choose
that's
that.
why. I mean, to be honest, the other colleague of mine, he was doing research on it for quite a while. And when I took over my position as a senior staff cybersecurity architect, I happened to see what these guys were doing. But since your brain works towards mainly on malware and memory forensics, they've been writing Yara rules for a year and a half, in and out on malware. So my mind constantly works on that, and seeing tons of malspam over the years, right? The one thing that struck me immediately was embedding malware inside DICOM. So that's the only thing that came to my mind. And the other thing was how to stop it. So I mean, so DICOM is basically a very simple thing. Okay, let's probably talk about it now. Earlier, if you had visited the hospital, probably I'll talk about our generation when we used to go to the hospital. When we fall down, we had a fracture. They used to give the X-ray and used a chalk piece to mark on it, right? And then remember, they used to put everything inside a folder. I still remember carrying those folders everywhere, right? Now everything has become digital today, right? Now, in the same hospital, when you do an MRI scan, a CT scan, and an X-ray, each of this has got tons of metadata to it: name, age, date of birth, sex, and blood group, let's say, for example, or can be even insurance details. Everything gets tagged to something called as a DICOM. It's a digital format that gets moved around inside hospitals today.
I think it's pretty fast also. I think there's a benefit that we have seen with everything being digitized. You can get the report in the same day. It's quite convenient for users. Yeah.
Exactly. And also, if you just observe your hospital, the doctor probably opens his computer. You all would have wondered what are doctors doing with computers, right? Now, this is one of the solid things that they use. Now, everything is being digitized. If you observe, doctors have been using applications to key in the patient observations. That's why the moment you give your patient ID, everything, history, who saw you, everything comes at one shot.
Yeah.
Now, adding to it, there is always something that he shows you in your computer, turns the monitor and says, dude, this is where your fracture is. That's because of the DICOM. It's a digitized format of your X-rays and scans. Now, this moves around with using something called a PAX server. It's like a protocol. Okay, the server, you have store, move, like HTTP post get put. This has got something like move, store, and it moves around your DICOMs across seamlessly from the devices to the technician, or to the technician to the doctors. Now, everything has a flaw. Okay, now what happens when you read a DICOM? It's a digital format. There is something called as a preamble. Usually what happens in this, the preamble is basically stripped when somebody reads it. Now, there was a research done about when you strip a preamble and you can insert some malicious content to it. We probably went one step ahead and we started talking about how can we insert PowerShell into it, and how can that same, now when it comes to DICOM, it's Windows. There's no Linux involved into it. Okay. And that's
Okay.
the boon. That's the major boon here. Okay.
For
And
attackers.
and yeah, and you would have still seen a lot of hospitals using Windows XP. Shocking but true.
Yeah.
Many of our A teams also work on XP, if you observed. And especially if you've seen some of these advertisement boards, you'll see sometimes those won't work. But you've seen this Windows XP logo kind of move around, or 7 move around.
Or
right?
errors
Now,
or exceptions.
exactly.
A lot of those things, yeah.
Now, the moment you speak about Windows and the moment you speak about PowerShell, the first thing that comes to your mind is process injection. Now, the beauty of which Windows is built is one process can always access another process's memory. That is because the way that Windows is built. That was built just for debugging purpose, but the attackers took it. You would have seen a lot of videos on process injection, hollow process injection, a thread, sleep the thread and wake the thread again, spin a new thread. Tons of stuff, right? I mean, a lot of DLL injections usually happen. Side loading of DLLs and tons of attacks. Now, what we started on experimental purpose and research for this DICOM was, let's say we were able to infect the DICOM, and the DICOM is being transferred to the hospital, and a doctor probably opens it in a screen. Now, most of these, there's again a catch here. Now, DICOMs can be viewed only using DICOM readers.
Okay.
It's like a software. It's like a software which, when you probably feed on it or double click on it, it opens like a GUI, and that's called as a reader. It allows you to do a bunch of operations, mark it, zoom in, zoom out. Let's ignore the technical stuff. What we were thinking is, and we were proposed in our talk, which you were mentioned about our talk in NullCon Goa. So that talk was named as "Honey, I Put the Hospital on Ventilator." So that was a talk, and what we did there, another colleague of mine named Rakesh, we worked on this, and what we did was, I brought in the idea. The portion of research of DICOM and its pitfalls was his, and I just brought in the malware piece of things to it. Now I said, what if I'm able to inject through process injection into the DICOM reader itself? Because that's going to be a process. This is going to be a process.
Yeah.
And in Windows, if I do create tool snapshot 32, and next iter 32, it's going to show me the list of processes. Then it's all about get current process ID and virtual alloc, and then you allocate memory into the process, and then you get the context of the thread, location of it, write the code into it. Now, so this is what we were discussing. Now, if the DICOM has the capacity to download the malware and then you inject into the DICOM reader, then you're probably doing a huge bunch of things. I mean, that means it's inside the memory, it's a process injection, it's a stealth technique, you're not making any entries to the registry. It's just going to live in the memory, die in the memory. Now, imagine this is being right. I mean, so this is what we spoke about DICOMs. And there is a section of which I cannot talk about because we have a defensive publication for it. But however, when you ask this question, I'll bring in this answer to you. There is a small catch in it, which I won't tell, but I'll tell you the major aspect of what we worked on.
Okay.
One way usually to detect malware attacks is using entropy. Okay. Now, people who think we're crazy to talk about it, but it's a thermodynamics concept. If there is a state change, then that's where entropy comes into picture. This is actually a law of this is basically thermodynamics.
Right.
Now, every file inside a computer, let's say when we calculate an entropy, will have a value. Okay, let's take this malspam example only again. Now, I have a PDF document. Okay, but this is not foolproof. It'll work in certain aspects that you have to do a lot of work to it, but I'll give you the base idea of it. Now, I have a PDF. Let's take a bank statement, for example. What are the two constants in it? One, it'll be password protected. And second thing, it'll have a lot of images, multimedias, logos, and then a lot of stuff inside it. Let's calculate the entropy for that file. Let's say it's 5.0. We use something called a Shannon's entropy theory. Don't ask me to tell the theory. I don't remember about it. But Shannon's entropy theory helps you to calculate the entropy. You can Google about
Yeah, it's
Shannon's
a
entropy theory.
known theory of
It's
entropy.
a known thing. It's being used in a lot of malware places. Okay, malware analysis especially. Now I'll give you a concept here. Now, let's say the value that for a good document is 5. Do you know that PDF documents can also contain embedded Word documents?
Yeah, I'd done some work on PDF earlier.
So this malware basically embedded a Word document inside a PDF.
Okay.
Now you calculate the entropy for it now. If it's a normal PDF document, the value is going to be 5.
Yeah.
But do you see a state change that there is a JavaScript, there is another embedded Word document? If you see histogram side of things, the value will be more. And that's the problem with malware. The more it hides, the more it sticks out. So there we made a difference saying that, dude, let's not go too deep into it and waste much time in analyzing it. One vector which we observed was entropy.
What I wanted to know, so we've been talking a lot on the technical side, right? We've been talking about entropy, we've been talking about file level things, but from a lot of our listeners would be in the security teams or in general in the industry, in the development teams or other places where they are also working on healthcare devices such. And from the malspam perspective that we have been talking about, in general, also in when we talk about phishing, right? In general, malspam and phishing are in similar areas. We talk about basic controls like having, first of all, avoid having too much data or having too much data lying around so that people do not get a pretext or attackers do not get the right kind of pretext for sending you such kind of mails, or even have employee awareness so they do not click on such malspam, or having technical controls against phishing, like, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, that we've been listening to, I think, for quite some time. But when it comes to healthcare industry and what you have seen works there, what do you think, apart from these basic controls, what are the steps that an organization or security teams can take when they're dealing with particularly medical devices or healthcare devices?
One thing would be is see, every malspam or every threat that's going to target any of our devices is technically 90% is an exploit. It could be an outdated exploit, or once the attacker is in, he'll probably try to do a backdoor or port is open of sorts. Now, hardening is something basic that everybody has to do. Some of the industries don't do it, especially from other organizations, right? Having unwanted, if you see a lot of devices that are there in the market, there will be a lot of backdoors that will be there for the developers to go in to troubleshoot it. That needs to be well thought out, well sorted out. The main thing I see is employee awareness. I mean, education is the most important. You can buy $1 trillion firewall, or you can have it. You can have an NGFW, which is backed by a PFSense, which is backed by a big spanking set of big Yara rules and everything. But end of the day, you have an employee. Let's take a hospital example, right? Please check my all it takes a receptionist to click on something. Very simple. Now, if you go to most of the hospitals in India, the receptionist has an absolute access to everything. You'll see they put your data, how long it takes for you to find out in LinkedIn where that person works, the name, get those details, and just go send an email saying, hey, you know what, this is my pending payment for this receipt, or my payment did not go through, or need an appointment. Doctor asked me to forward this. Somebody opens, they're doomed. Employee awareness is the key here, and phishing tests everybody does today, okay, and but you should educate your employees in a very gamified manner on latest threats. That's very, very important, and I feel gamification is the biggest solution to this. Nothing more, nothing less. You cannot ask an organization to I mean, see, to be very honest, Milo, I think you and I dread and I hate those sometimes these trainings, right? You have to take that 45 minute training to understand what is phishing, right? But it makes it monotonous. Most of them skip it. Most of them find ways to get the pass certificate. It doesn't even the odds anywhere, right? I mean, but if you gamify it in a very interesting manner, and play with it, and people would love to do this, right? And you should conduct mock drills some of the times. A lot of stuff should happen. But when you spoke about this SPF, DKIM, DMARC, honestly, it works in detection of malspams only to an extent. Nothing, because because there are other ways of doing it, right? I mean, sometimes when we worked also on malspam writing Yara rules, DMARC and DKIM, when we checked for it, gave us a lot of false positives. So see, some of those organizations will not have SPF checks in place. They would have it turned it off, right? Now an SPF has to be mandated at some point of time. A DMARC has to be mandated at some point of time. But some of the, I cannot take names here, but some of the bigger organizations don't have it turned off. Now, if I write a Yara rule saying that if you look for SPF, let SPF be no, then I'm doomed. My false positive will hit the roof some point of time. Now, attackers are beyond this. Attacks are beyond this. You cannot rely on these things. I honestly always feel is gamification of employee awareness. That's the best thing that you can do to yourself. And you can take it to schools also. You can take it to colleges. You can take it to your employees. I think gone are those days where you say Ram works in a company. He's an IT administrator. He sits and works today. Now click those 4 choices. Should he delete the mail? Should he forward the mail? That doesn't work anymore. You will have to immerse the person. Cyber security, Neil, you be very honest, you work on a lot of exploit development, right? I mean, would you go and put a PPT on how to develop an exploit? You would rather believe in writing one and solving one.
Yeah.
That's how I always feel. Cyber security training, awareness has to be taken to the next level. You should immerse the audience in the experience, otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, running the exploit for yourself, seeing it work, getting the high, and then getting the experience, I think that is unforgettable.
Yep.
But for these healthcare specific campaigns, right? Like I'm talking about the malspam campaigns. Through these education awareness initiatives that you're talking about, maybe we can also talk about the campaigns currently running for healthcare, because we are specifically talking about healthcare domains. I was just curious and just wanted to quickly know, are there also campaign information sharing that happens between healthcare providers, that there is such a campaign or malspam campaign going on for example, COVID or for any other?
Nothing I know of.
Pretext.
Usually people say don't click on the mails that you don't know. That's what I've seen. There is not an extensive campaign that runs saying, hey, dude, you know what? This malspam variant is running across. Please don't click on it. I think many of the companies, you should educate your employees. The only mistake that we make at times, right? We think that, hey, how will a HR guy understand what is TrickBot or what is OSNIF or what is... You should educate. It's your duty to simplify it and educate them. Now, that is the most important thing, right? Because now the trend that we usually, or not even the trend, the practice is virus. Oh, my computer is infected by a virus. But you have to know how it comes, right? Unless you don't know the mode of entry, if you know the mode of entry only, you'll stop clicking on it. So you will have to educate people saying that, hey, this is macroless malware. Be careful. Now that basically avoids the entire malspam chain. Now look for the email address where it comes from. If it's a Proton mail, don't click on it. If it's a malfound Gmail, don't click on it. Look for the spell checks for a malspam. Usually it'll say, dear urgent, please open immediately. The spell check is to avoid this machine learning algorithms. And then you'll have an attachment, usually it's named invoice underscore or urgent, PTM, doc, insura, something of that sort, not the full names usually. See, if you backtrace the whole thing and educate them saying that this is how it looks, this is what you should not do, nobody opens it.
Yeah, right? Totally. So, I think gamification totally helps seeing how the entry point is, seeing what the real impact is, because they don't see what happens behind the scenes. Although I will just leave our conversation on that note that with AI and ChatGPT coming in, I don't know if spelling mistakes are a thing anymore. But
Absolutely.
yeah, just the intent of it, right? If you were expecting a mail or not expecting a mail, and a lot of
True.
those things, like you mentioned, will definitely help with the gamification. And overall, I think in making sure that we develop that critical thinking attitude for employees in the healthcare industry.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Shyam. We had a very good conversation today, and thanks for touching upon so many of these things, and especially DICOM, your area of research. And I would highly recommend all the listeners to go and watch out his talk. We'll be providing that in our show notes soon. Thanks a lot for joining us today for Breakpoint Security Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Neelu, for Breakpoint podcast, and thank you for having me on your show today. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking one of the podcasts with no holds bar, saying that don't go deep into technical. You always ask me to go deep into technical. Something which I love doing it. And to all the audience who's listening, it's been an amazing series. Please do listen. A lot of genres of talks. You can go back to season 1 and listen to the variety of talks that were provided. A lot of great insights, a lot of industry greats and well-knowledge people come and talk on the show. So please do listen to it. Thanks, Neelu, for doing it. It's need of the hour in the industry, and you're doing a fabulous job. So I wish you all the best with this, and thank you for having me on your show today.
Thanks for joining us. See everyone in the next episode. Bye-bye.
See you guys. Bye-bye.
Hey folks, that's all we had for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Visit the podcast page for more such interesting episodes. You will find the speaker suggestions and other details in the show notes below. If you're interested in a security challenge of your own or would like to hear from a specific speaker or team, let me know in the comments below. Lastly, if you liked the episode, please go ahead, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share with others in the community. It always means a lot when you do that. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, Breakpoint signing off.